And today's guest is Brother Darryl Lansey, and I'm hoping I pronounced the last name correct.
That's correct.
That's good. I'm just going to, I'll tell you what, I'm just going to read uh, uh, some of your bio, maybe most of it,
Okay.
and then I'm going to let you tell your story.
Okay.
And I wrote down 10 questions, but we don't have to get that. Other people may have questions, and we'll just let it flow like that. All right.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right. So Darryl Lansey was CIA's Director of Leadership Learning prior to his retirement, March 2018, after a 33-year career. He was responsible for creating and executing CIA's vision, guiding philosophy, and strategy for providing enterprise level training for new supervisors to senior executives. Previous to leadership learning, he was the National Reconnaissance Officer Chief and Deputy Chief Learning Officer. During Darrell's CIA career, he served in 4 of 5 directorates, including more than 20 years in the Directorate of Intelligence, where he authored and managed analysis on an array of topics, including chemical and biological weapons proliferation, narcotics, counterterrorism, and the Balkans. Upon Darrell's retirement, CIA awarded him with its Career Commendation Medal, which was the last of more than 30 exceptional performance awards and citations that he received during his career. In retirement, Darryl is seeking mastery of his photography skills, which has been a hobby for more than 45 years, and he has a link to his publisher. You know, I was trying to pull up the song by I'm trying to think of that group, A Thin Line Between Love and Hate. Maybe we can get it played before.
Persuaders.
Yeah, the Persuaders. For those of us that can remember that far back. And so I'm gonna just turn it over to our special guest, Brother Darryl Lansey. Thank you for coming.
I thank you, Mr. Amenhotep, for having me and other members of the Wosei Community Church and my cousin Damani for the invitation tonight. I really appreciate it. This is my honor to come out and speak to you all. I will say up front, I have some notes off to the side, so occasionally if you see me looking down, it's because I want to stay on track of where I am. My plan tonight is just to spend a few minutes going through key aspects of my book, what led to me to writing the book, and some of the things that experiences that I had that led me to feel like I needed to write this book. I began thinking about writing this book in 2007, actually. That was 11 years before I retired. I was making a transition between jobs. I had spent 22 years of my career in the Director of Intelligence, which you indicated in the bio, and I spent that 22 years as an analyst, writing reports that would go directly to the President of the United States and other policymakers who were involved in United States foreign policy. And then I became a manager of analysts. And then in 2007, I was at an inflection point in my career and trying to decide what I was going to do next. I'll come back to this. I'll try to remember to come back to this. But there was an incident in my career that led me to decide it was time to make an internal career change. And I made a change from being an analyst for the first 22 years of my career to being what is called an intelligence educator, which is essentially a teacher. And so I spent the last 10 years of my career essentially serving as a teacher, primarily focused on leadership and management training. That was what ultimately led me to my role at the National Reconnaissance Office as the Chief Learning Officer and the role of the Deputy Chief Learning Officer as well. As I mentioned, I began thinking about writing this book back then. I retired in March of 2018, at the time I retired, I had no intention, I would say 6 months before that, I had no intentions of retiring. But the events of 12 August 2017, which was the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, drove me to make the decision ultimately to retire when I did. And ultimately, when I retired, led me to write the book that I've been thinking about since 2007. So in 2000, as you may recall, on 12 August 2017, neo-Nazis, the KKK, and other white supremacists went to the University of Virginia campus in Charlottesville, Virginia, and they had a rally, in which, during the rally, a woman named Heather Heyer was killed by a car that was driven by a white supremacist. And that event had a profound effect on me. And one of the things that I did as my last job, which was the director of leadership learning, is I used to write a weekly blog. It was a leadership blog, and I would write a blog post on a variety of topics. And on the 21st of August of 2017, I wrote a blog entitled Leadership and Moral Courage, in which I essentially asked the question, given what happened in Charlottesville, where is the leadership and moral courage? Although I didn't call out explicitly the Trump administration or the head of my organization at the time, Mike Pompeo, who went on to become Secretary of State, I asked the question about where's the leadership and moral courage? Because there was no, as I pointed out in my blog, there were no good people on both sides. There were bad people on one side. There were not good people on both sides. And I published that blog on the 21st of August, which was a Monday. On that Wednesday, I was called in by my supervisor into his office and asked if I would modify my blog post because interestingly, they didn't have any issue with my writing the blog. They had a concern that, quote, my thesis statement wasn't clear enough, that I wasn't making a direct connection between leadership and moral courage. I thought I was at the time. Anyway, we agreed to disagree. I was called back into my supervisor's office again that Thursday, which was the 24th of August of 2017, and asked if I would make a modification to the blog, and I refused to do so. It just so happens I was off on a leave on the 25th of August, 2017, which was a Friday. And my boss called me at home and said that the blog was being removed from the internal database in which I had written it. There was a lot of internal discussion within CIA whether or not to leave the blog up. In fact, there were members within the Office of General Counsel who said, leave the blog up, because if we take it down, that's just going to cause more controversy than if we leave it up. There were others who said, take it down. And ultimately, they cited an internal regulation that essentially said that the use of internal information systems to, paraphrasing here, to incite disturbances won't be tolerated. So the blog post was taken down. Now, prior to the blog being taken down, there was a lot of good conversations that occurred within the organization about my blog post. And in fact, I had people come up to me, white, black, brown, and all kinds of others, some who agreed with it and some who disagreed with it. But they all agreed that I had a right to state my thoughts. I had a good friend of mine actually come to my office one morning and said, you know, Darryl, they're going to take you to the woodshed over this. But anyway,
sure. That's a good choice of words. You know, and I was listening to your other interview and the Spear Chucker comment.
Right.
You know, Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's all right. I'll come to that.
Yeah.
So, and it was in that moment that it was, as I describe in the book, the last of the indicators in my career that I decided it was time to step away from the organization. And as I describe in the book, I was also having from August of 2017, beginning with the blog that I wrote, essentially through the time that I retired in March of 2018, I was having some health issues. I was having I've suffered through migraines all my life, especially during my career. But I was having severe migraines. I was having muscle spasms, uncontrollable muscle spasms, to the point where I went to the doctor in November of 2017, or October 2017, actually. And my doctor said, Mr. Lansey, I have good news and bad news. The good news is it's not your heart, because I was concerned it was my heart because of family history of heart disease. The bad news is you're under such stress that you need to take a break. Anyway, but the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville was the catalyst for me to make a decision to step away, and actually gave me a time to begin to think about writing my book. You alluded to the song, The Thin Line Between Love and Hate, The Persuaders. I chose the title for my book intentionally. As I describe in the back cover of my book, my relationship with the agency, I call it a strange love affair. And like the Persuaders song, it was not only a strange love affair, but I felt like an abused spouse, where my spouse was cheating on me. And so I had the love of the organization and the love of knowing that I was actively involved in protecting the United States of America from its enemies and adversaries. And so that individuals such as yourselves were able to go to sleep at night without knowing what was going on behind the scenes, while at the same time feeling like my relationship with the agency was an abusive one. And throughout my career, especially early on in my career when I was in the Director of Intelligence, I mentored numerous employees, especially numerous Black employees, and all of them asked, Darryl, why have you stayed so long? And I would tell them all the same thing. I stay because I love the work. I stay because I like to travel. I stay because of the security. But ultimately, the real truth was because there's a thin line between love and hate. And like an abusive relationship, I spent a lot of time over the years thinking about what else could I have done with my career and life's work. So that's where the title of the book came from. I will also say about the book, I intentionally decided not to write the book just about the agency. I thought it was important for me to tell a journey of, and this is why I call it a journey, to include my family history, things from my childhood, my family's history, even going back to the days of slavery. So I have enslaved members of my family. They were enslaved in Georgia and Virginia and in Maryland. And their experiences ultimately affected my experiences. And I didn't actually realize it until doing my own research. But we are all a product of our ancestry, whether we realize it or not. And so I tell the story of my family history, my childhood, my time at the University of Delaware, and then ultimately that led me to the agency. I tell that journey because I think it's important for the reader, but it was important for me to understand how those events impacted my thinking and my reactions in growing up. So what I will do is I'm gonna briefly cover some key elements or timelines in my history that sort of have impacted my
Darryl,
views on. Yes.
Would you need to share your screen?
No, I didn't do a PowerPoint because
Okay.
I
Okay.
didn't want to.
I thought I'd check.
Oh, okay.
I thought I'd check.
Um, and I'm counting on individuals like Damani and others that I know who have read the book. If you have any questions, feel free to step in. I'm going to try to make this as brief as possible because I'm really interested in hearing from you all and the questions you might have. So I start my book with a brief history of my family on both my mother's side of the family and my father's side of the family. As I said, so we're enslaved individuals on both my mother and father's side of the family. And I tell that history because that history to me is important to me, as it was important to how I was raised. I tell the story about my mother's side of the family, especially as a child, how much um, the love. I'm very fortunate. You see, the individuals are showing up tonight. I have a family that is a large family, more than 60 cousins and second cousins and first cousins and third cousins. There's a tremendous amount of love there, and that love and values were created early on in my life. And that was on my mother's side of the family. And thank you. Um, and that is an important element of history because that love was also about um, my self-worth as an individual. And so as I went through some of the experiences in my life, I always had the grounding of what my mother told me, what my family represented and stood for on both my mother and father's side of the family. And so it was important for me to tell that element of my life. I'm explicit in the book. I am the first experiences that I had, memorable experiences I had about race and racism in America was the 1968 riots after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. I was 6 years old, but it's very vivid to me to this day because we had a grocery store that was next to our house, and that grocery store was burned, not to the ground, but it was engulfed in flames to the point where my family and I had to escape. And in the midst of that, the anger that people had over the riots, and trying to come to grips, even as a child, of what was happening around me. Why was that happening? Why were people so angry? And having my mother and father trying to explain to me what was going on. I tell just briefly in the book, I tell a story to this day. I hate the winter because people are burning wood in their fireplace and the smoke gets into my house and I walk my entire house until I know there's no fire, and then I'm able to go back to sleep. And so I imagine, as I say in my book, I could make some psychiatrists or psychologists very rich in exploring those stories. But as I say, again, back to my case of being a child, the people that I saw as a child, primarily in a Black community. So I grew up in West Baltimore. Anybody who's seen the TV show The Wire, that is a portion of West Baltimore that I grew up in. And as I say in the book, the characters in The Wire, they were not fictional characters to me. They were fictional portrayals of people that I knew well and grew up with. My brothers and I grew up with. And we were all dealing with the same issues within that community. But that experience, I grew up in a community, predominantly Black community. The only whites that I ever saw were next door, the grocery store next door that was owned prior to 1968 by a Jewish family who had survived the Holocaust, the white police who roamed through my neighborhood, and occasionally the people in the department stores and the local A&P. So my community is a predominantly Black community. My family So we had Black-owned businesses in my community. My family owned businesses, a laundry and a bank. We went to a dry cleaners that was owned by Blacks. My point being, my immediate surrounding was a Black community, and a Black community that um, was, in a sense, self-contained. Um, and the 1968 riots, really, even at 6 years old, like I said, is embedded in my brain to this day. As I say in my book, the year I became woke to the issues of race in America. My worldview was expanded. Well, when I say my worldview, my view of the white community, all but primarily Jewish community, was expanded in 1974. I was given a scholarship to a small private school that was founded by Jews in 1912, who were not allowed to go to Baltimore City public schools. They were discriminated against. And I received a scholarship to go to that school. And that experience was both good and bad. It was a great experience as I got a great education. And for the most part, because the kids I went to school with were, their grandparents were often survivors of the Holocaust, it was antithetical to them to be racist. The idea of hearing a racist comment from them was out of the question. Interestingly enough, the people who were not Jewish and white that I went to school with were the ones that I had the greatest issues with. Anyway, I include that in there because, again, I think it's important for me in the book to tell the journey of how I've got to where I did in terms of CIA. Let me fast forward. I graduated from high school in 1980, and I went to the University of Delaware in Newark, Delaware. It looks like Newark, New Jersey, but it's Newark, Delaware. And for those who don't know, Delaware, along with Mississippi and Alabama, were three of the last states that were under federal desegregation mandates. And so I entered the University of Delaware in 1980 on an engineering scholarship at a time when the state of Delaware was undergoing, it was at the early stages of desegregation, and desegregation, which was similar to what was going on in Boston, very violent, and people did not like, white folks did not like the idea of going to school with Black folks. So I entered the University of Delaware in 1980. My first experience on the campus, less than a week on the campus, walking down the campus and having a car drive by, and the folks on the campus, the white folks, saying "niggers go home." I had roommates who had a triple room, two white roommates who consistently and continuously did their best to, frankly, try to get rid of me, including writing things like "KKK, we want you out" on my desk bulletin board. It was a campus which was full of a small Black and brown community, and a lot of, frankly, overt racism, including up until my sophomore year, white fraternities holding what they would call slave auctions, in which they would auction off their fraternity brothers to for dates for women, to come and clean people's rooms. But it wasn't until the very small Black population on the University of Delaware campus began to complain that those slave auctions were ultimately ended. Interestingly enough, those slave auctions were run primarily by a fraternity called Kappa Alpha. Kappa Alpha has its roots in the KKK. Mitch McConnell, for example, I believe, is a member of Kappa Alpha. Again, just to give you some flavor of that journey. I was on campus. I graduated in 1984. I was debating whether I was going to graduate school or going to work. And I ended up interviewing with the CIA. And it was on a whim. And as I tell the story in my book, CIA actually came to my campus looking for business majors. I started out as an engineering major, but as I describe in the book, both my buddies to my left and to my right in my freshman engineering class got their mechanical engineering scholarships, their degree, excuse me. I got weeded out, but I ultimately got my degree in geography and geology. So anyway, CIA came to campus in 1983 initially, and they were looking for business majors. And I went to a meeting one night with regards to getting a job at the agency. And when the gentleman was finished talking, I asked a question. I raised my hand. I said, "I'm not a business major. I'm a geography and geologist. Do you hire individuals like me?" And the guy said, "If you're one of the first people in line tomorrow morning, I will interview you." And I got up before the crack of dawn, got in line to be interviewed. The funniest thing from that interview, I remember, and I describe this in my book, the gentleman asking me, he said, "So where do you see yourself 20 years from now?" Back in the days when they would ask questions like that. And I said, "I see myself as the director someday." That was a pretty bold statement coming from somebody who was 22 years old then. And he literally pushed his chair back from the table and slid about 6 feet back. And he looked at me and he said, "What makes you think you can be the director 20 someday?" And my response was, "Well, if I got to get out of my bed early every morning, I at least got to believe that I can get to that level someday." I frankly thought that I would ended my chances of getting to the CIA. It didn't. I ultimately interviewed for the agency. And when I interviewed, one of the individuals I interviewed with said, "Have you thought about going to graduate school?" And I said, "Yes, but I haven't finalized my decision." And she said to me, "You have a better chance if you go to graduate school and then apply." So I ended up going to graduate school at the University of Delaware. My girlfriend, now wife at the time, we both got fellowships for graduate school. And during my first year of graduate school, when it was at the end of my first year, I went and became what they call a graduate fellow. And so I actually started at the CIA in June of 1985 as a student, as a graduate student. And that experience was a good experience. And it was a kind of experience where I said, I think this is a job that I would enjoy doing. And that ultimately began my 33-year odyssey with the agency. 22 years in the Director of Intelligence, and I'm going to briefly go through that. I spent the first 4.5 of my years working counter narcotics. That was very important to me because I grew up in a community in West Baltimore that, as it is today, has a serious issue with narcotics. And my goal was to figure out a way to prevent narcotics from coming into my neighborhood. Now, some of you may be thinking, and maybe even want to ask the question, because I had this question asked to me when I was working counter narcotics and I used to recruit for the agency. I don't know if you all remember the San Jose Mercury story and question about the agency responsible for bringing narcotics into San Jose and
That was Gary Webb.
Yep.
And he wrote Dark Alliance.
Yeah. So I will tell you what I've told individuals when I was recruiting and to this day. I have no evidence, none, that the agency was involved in and sanctioned the delivery of narcotics to the Black community, either on the West Coast or the East Coast. And I will say today what I said more than 20 years ago when I was recruiting for the agency. If I had any indication whatsoever that that was occurring and it was sanctioned, I would have resigned on the spot, because I spent the first 4.5 years of my career trying to prevent such of an occurrence happening. Um, and I'm not naive enough to say that there might not have been people who were doing things that were off the book and unsanctioned. Um, as we know, there are individuals like Ali North who was involved in the Iran-Contra, and they did all kinds of shady stuff behind the scenes. There's no evidence that the agency sanctioned it. I will also say this, in fact, there was a point in my career when I worked counter narcotics um, in which I wrote a memo based, and I won't go into the whole story, but I wrote a memo based on something that I had discovered. And suffice it to say, at one point, my bosses were called up to the Hill with a question, and they pulled my memo out of the file as proof that we weren't doing what we were being accused of. Because I had evidence to the contrary. I had evidence that what people were claiming was occurring on the ground. There was no evidence of it. Let me, without again going into much detail, when I worked counter narcotics, I was an imagery analyst, meaning that I used a variety of classified and unclassified satellite information to address the narcotics issue. And what the United States was being accused of, there was no evidence of that in what I was looking at. And I had written a memo to that fact. So my point being, again, question may be on folks' mind, if I had any evidence, I would have resigned on the spot. So anyway, I spent 4.5 years of my career working counter narcotics. My first experience, and I won't say this was with regard to racism, this was classism, as I discuss in my book. I had never been on an airplane in my life before joining the agency, never. And my first opportunity to fly on an airplane was in March of 1987. And my boss at the time, we were sitting down, we were talking about the upcoming trip. And I said, I'm looking forward to it because I've never been on an airplane in my life. And he looked at me and he said, if I'd known you had never been on an airplane before, I wouldn't have hired you. And I won't, that was not, I didn't see it as an issue of racism, but an issue of classism. I grew up in a household that neither of my parents drove. We didn't have a car until I was 15 years old. And as I described in my book, when my mother purchased a car for my brother, my middle brother, to go back and forth to college, the price of the car was $6,000. And my brother recalls my mother saying, that's just too much money. And from her perspective, it was, because it was $1,000 more than what my parents had paid for their mortgage. And so we didn't have a car. The city of Baltimore had mass transportation. And my parents certainly didn't have the money for plane tickets. As I describe in my book, when I was going to that private school, I had an opportunity potentially to go to France with my French class. The trip was ultimately canceled. And my mother said to me, don't worry, Darryl, someday you're going to go more places than France. And she was right. I ultimately ended up going to 16 different countries and 6 of the 7 continents on Earth. So anyway, I spent 4.5 years as a counter narcotics analyst. I then went and spent a year going through training that is typically reserved for individuals who are what you all would think of as a traditional spy, a case officer. So I wanted as an analyst to understand how the case officers went out and recruited spies to spy for the United States. And so I spent a year learning that tradecraft. as I describe in the book, one of the things they teach is, for instance, surveillance and counter surveillance, which was not new to me. My father raised my two brothers and I in West Baltimore, his version of surveillance and counter surveillance. He always taught us to know who was around us at any one time, to use change of directions if we had to, never take the same route to and from anywhere you were going, have multiple routes to get home. But that was an experience. It taught me in that experience that it was an important skill or occupation for the agency to have. But I knew that I did not want to have human beings' lives in my hands. When I graduated from that program, and then as I described in my book, and you, Minister, you talked about the spear chucker comment. So that was when I graduated from that program, I ended up in my first analytic job, where first blatant experience of racism, and from that point on, it got even more interesting. So overt racism, yes. So in 1991, I was working the war in the Balkans and Eastern Europe. I'll make this quick. I had gone to brief the deputy director of the CIA. And when I came back from that meeting, my boss looked at me and my workmate who went to that meeting and said, "I'm glad I sent the right spear chucker for the job." And I said, "Excuse me?" And he said, "Yeah." And I was stunned by his comment. I got up from my chair after a couple of minutes of listening to him, and I said, I excused myself and I went back to my cubicle. My boss later on tried to make the excuse that he was, spear chucker. He didn't really mean spear chucker, but it was, from his perspective, spear chucker was not a bad thing. He recalled there was a Spear Chucker Jones who was a football player, and when he was growing up in New England, the only Spear Chucker Jones.
Can I pause you right
Sure.
there? So, yeah, my first encounter with Spear Chucker was in the movie MASH.
MASH.
And Fred Williamson played that role. Did you find that kind of contempt ran through the agency? I guess I'm asking two questions. That one, and do you think that these things were directed at you personally, of what of who you were, or was it because of what you were?
Both. And so I say both, because I entered the agency initially in 1985, and there was still very few Black employees and other employees of color when I entered the agency. And most of and I describe this in the book, most of the supervisors that I encountered had not had Black employees working for them, and frankly did not know how to interact with us. And in the I describe in the book elements of what today would be called microaggressions, where I would be in meetings and someone would say, "Oh, you're really articulate, aren't you? You're well spoken." The gentleman who called me a spear chucker, I sat in meeting after meeting before the spear chucker incident, where I would raise a topic for possible publication for the President's Daily Brief the next morning, and I would be ignored. And my white colleagues would raise the same topic a few minutes later, and he would say, "Great idea, run with it." It got so bad that and I describe this in my book, at the time, Star Trek Next Generation was on the air, and the character Mr. Worf, which was played by Michael Dorn, who's a Black actor, I would come home to my wife and I say, "I feel like, Worf today." And as I describe in the book, I don't know if you're familiar with Star Trek Next Generation.
Oh yes, and I'm familiar with that character, that particular character. Keep going.
Yeah, and Worf had this incredible way of warning the Captain Picard that they were going to run into some particular danger, and Picard would essentially say, "Chill out, Mr. Worf. I got this handled." And that's the way I felt. It was like I would raise an issue, and I was getting, "Chill out, Mr. Worf. We got this." And I was being ignored until one day, one of the senior white analysts that I was working with, he turned to my manager and he said, "Just, I've watched you repeatedly ignore Darryl when he raises a topic, and then someone else raises the exact same topic and you say, run with it." And I give that particular analyst a lot of credit for stepping up and showing leadership and doing that. That individual.
Can I ask, since I'm going to ask the question. I see Brother Kalahari has raised his hand.
Okay.
But I wanted to say, in the interview that I heard with you, your father encouraged you as you went off away to school to speak the King's English, and so you became bilingual. You spoke the language of your neighborhood, and you spoke the language of your new school.
I did, and I'm actually glad you raised that, because I'm really glad, because it's an important element here. So growing up when I went off to that private school, I described this in my book. I came home one day, and one of the older kids in my neighborhood said, "What grade are you in?" I said 7th, and I pronounced the TH. And he said, "Who the F do you think you are? Why can't you speak like the rest of us niggas?" and then I would go to my school, and because the vernacular of growing up where I did, I used to say, instead of ask, ax, as in ax. And the white kids at school every day, whenever I would say, "I want to ask you a question," they would do the chop motion. And so I learned very quickly to code switch. And I spoke the King's English when I went to my private school, because my father said, "Speak the King's English." And I spoke the language of my neighborhood when I came home. And it was the same way at work. The interesting dynamic of, like a lot of corporations, when I was around my white colleagues, their expectation is you speak the King's English. Not only do you speak the King's English, you write the King's English. And when you're around your fellow employees of color, you speak however you're comfortable. To the point on the King's English, early in my career, the first 22 years of career in the DI, many of the Black employees that I grew up with in the Directorate of Intelligence, between 50 to 60% of them, in my estimation, left the Directorate of Intelligence because, the ability to write intelligence in the way that the organization expects is one of the high expectations. But that expectation is levied to a greater degree, I would argue, on Black and brown employees. And many employees who started out in the Directorate of Intelligence with me end up leaving and going to other directorates and had much more successful careers. in particular, the Directorate of Support, which was earlier the Directorate of Administration, which was all of the administrative functions like HR and security and medical and logistics. That directorate also had many more Black employees, senior Black employees who could serve as mentors and sponsors. But yeah, being able to code switch and speaking the King's English. And my father, I'm actually glad you mentioned my father. My father, as I described in the book, my father dropped out of high school in the 11th grade. But he was always very much about us, my brothers and I, getting a good education. And but for the grace of God go I, staying out of trouble. My father very clearly said to my brothers, and I discussed this in the book, my brothers and me, to keep us in line, if you F up, I'm going to stick foot up your ass, pardon me, and it's going to take the Army, Navy, and Marines to pull it out. And he knew
that'll keep you straight.
Yes, it did. And he knew from his own experiences, but he also knew, given where we were living and growing up, that if he didn't do that, there was the possibility of us going astray.
Darryl, can I,
yes.
We had a question from Kalahari.
Sure. Yes.
And Kalahari, if you take yourself off mute and ask Brother Darryl your question, go ahead.
And I got a question after him. Yeah.
Okay, and then Damani. All right. Yes. Go ahead, Kalahari. You're muted. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Okay. In the San Francisco Chronicle, they call analysts cowards. No, they call analysts bean counters, and aides were called cowboys. Could I hear a comment on that?
I missed that.
Could you say again? Could you say again?
In the San Francisco Chronicle, they call the analysts bean counters and the agents cowboys.
Yeah. So the case officers or the individuals who go out and actually do the recruitment of spies, some do have a reputation of being cowboys. Both the men and women, the jobs that they're asked to do are extremely dangerous. These are individuals who more often than not, live overseas, and that's the environment in which they work in. Many of them work in environments that are they're in developing world environments, they're in hostile environments, they're in war zones. And so there's a certain bravado that those individuals have. But actually, believe it or not, many more of them are like me, they're introverts. And in fact, the most successful recruiters of spies are the ones who are laid back and chilled and introverts, because they're unassuming and they're able to move in and out of places that otherwise they wouldn't be able to do. In terms of the reference of the bean counters, that is a reference in terms of being an analyst. I mean, being a bean counter is you spend I spent more than 20 years looking at just a tidal wave of data coming at me, and it's even more so now as the years have passed, and you're trying to synthesize all of that data to make sense and to create a mosaic or to put that puzzle together so you can write a report or put together a briefing that you can then send to the president or the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State. And back to the issue of being a bean counter, I had a supervisor early in my career, and he was a statistician, and he said, Darryl, anybody can give me 50-50. That's flipping a coin. If you give me 60-40, I'll be happy. If you can give me 70-30, I'll be ecstatic. If you give me 80-20, I'll be over the top. What I need you to do is to walk out on a on a limb, but a well-supported limb, meaning I need you to make, we're being asked as an analyst, you're being asked to, in a sense, make a crystal ball, look at a crystal ball, and do analysis and make predictions of what you think may happen based on the evidence from coming in from a variety of sources. And we call that variety of intelligence sources. So it could be from satellite imagery, it could be from communications, it could be from a human source who's reporting to a case officer. All that has to be brought together. There is a bean counter aspect to it. And there is a cowboy aspect to the people who are on the other side of the house. But most of the individuals are not cowboys. In fact, like I said, most of the ones who are most effective are unassuming. And just one more note on that. When I was going through that program, I mentioned for a year, going through the same program that the case officers go through, I actually had one of the instructors try to recruit me into being a case officer. Because one advantage of being a light-skinned brown man with a goatee and a mustache, there's a lot of places in the world I can go to and blend in with not a lot of problems. All I need is the language skills. And I got outstanding grades during that year in the process. But that just wasn't me. There was another question.
Damani, you're up. All right. Come on, cousin Damani.
Okay. Yeah, Darryl, we got to move on. Time is moving here. I found your book to be like a case study in, hey, wrote down, a case study in how to deal with systemic racism.
Right.
How to deal and confront systemic racism. But I want to go back to page 82. In 1989, you approach a management. I like to say another thing. You do. I saw throughout your book, you was always solving problems. You was solving problems, organizational effectiveness, solving problems. But anyway, this one problem, you approached management about a research proposal you had about production estimate problem. DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, was doing estimates from basically from
border seizures,
sources that were seized at the border.
Right.
Can you explain? I know you went on to say that once they accepted your proposal, the director accepted your proposal, and your analysis of how you was coming up with production estimates of opium and marijuana. Why was that so important to the United States, and why did that cause an uproar across across so many departments?
Sure. So I started my career doing analysis of opium production, ultimately what leads to heroin. And the analysis that I was doing and the way we were doing it was initially based on lessons we had learned in looking at the Soviet Union and Soviet grain harvest. We had pretty much perfected our analysis of estimating the amount of opium that was being produced around the world and the amount of heroin that was coming into the country. The problem that we were having was we could not get a handle on the amount of marijuana that was being produced and the amount of marijuana that was coming into the country. And in fact, it was a very complex problem, but I thought that there was a potential way of attacking that problem. And as Damani alludes to and I discuss in the book, one of the things I prided myself on throughout my entire career was collaboration. And so I thought about the problem for a long time, and I went to my bosses with a proposal. It was a multi-pronged collaborative approach that would involve myself, other government agencies that had expertise, one example being USDA, several universities around the country, as well as expertise that existed overseas. I'll cut to the chase. With the help of, with my analysis, but with the help of a really good statistician, with the help of my director of operations colleagues who did some work with me overseas, we were able to crack the nut on estimating the amount of marijuana that was coming into the United States. What Damani is alluding to is when my report came out, it caused a major S-storm around the country with the other government agencies, because essentially what my analysis said, there was far more marijuana coming into the country than what my DEA colleagues were had estimated. They were looking at border seizures, and there was a lot of stuff that was getting past them. They had actually, the DEA and Customs and other government agencies had actually had to talk to various newspapers around the country, and they didn't mention me by name, but they did say, in so many words, the CIA analyst who's coming up with this analysis must be smoking something. My analysis, when it went up to the director at the time, was Judge Webster, who was a former FBI director. Now, I didn't initially get a chance to go talk to Judge Webster. I was still a relatively junior analyst. And my bosses went to see him along with the statistician. Ultimately, in the end, Judge Webster said, I've looked at the analysis. I'm confident in how the analysis was done and how the answers were arrived at. And he proceeded to talk to his counterparts around the intelligence community, as well as the folks in Congress with regards to the new estimate. As I say in the book, that was the first time in my career where I felt like this was a calling for me. I had solved a complex problem that the agency and the United States government had been trying to solve for years. And I say I solved it, but again, it was a collaborative approach. And it was the first time it was ever done. People were really mad at me because my analysis made it look like the DEA and Customs weren't doing their jobs. And that did not sit well with folks, because the DEA and Customs were concerned that they were going to lose money. Congress was going to cut their funds because they weren't doing their jobs. Well, that would be the perception. Ultimately, in the end, those organizations actually got more money to do their jobs. So that's what happened. Was there another question?
Can I ask another question? If
Sure.
I don't see anyone else. So please, don't take any offense.
No.
Ask this question. So you're at the interview. You come in. They say, "What do you see yourself in 20 years?" And you say, "I see myself as the head, as the director of the agency."
Right.
And okay, you're doing these things. Did you get the feeling that people perceived you as uppity? And that might be why some of the resistance that you were experiencing in your.
Well, yes. Yes. So, yes, on many levels. So, I will say that, and I'm going to address that question in the comment that Damani made. And I'm looking at my notes. So there were 4 levels of what I would call racism at the agency. There was overt racism. There was systemic racism. And then, well, 3 levels. And then there was what I would call conscious and unconscious biases and microaggressions. So when I encountered what I perceive to be racism at work, I didn't let it go. I often pushed back. And I quickly got a reputation as someone who was, quote, too serious. And so besides the spear chucker incident, the other case of overt racism, so early in my career, I got actively involved in early efforts within the agency with regards to diversity and inclusion. And that carried throughout my entire career. And I had one manager at one point in time, as I was participating in these various meetings, he walked up to my desk one day and he said, you know, you're a militant. And I said, excuse me? And he said, yeah, you're a militant. And I said, why? And he said, well, because you're always talking about, you know, the issues of race and diversity and inclusion. And I literally reached over to my desk and pulled down a dictionary and opened it up to the word militant. And I read the definition to him. And the definition says, Webster's definition is somebody who is bent on tearing down the institutions, including things like government. And I said, I work for CIA. Does that sound like somebody who was a militant? And then he said, well, I guess not, but you sure do talk a lot. And I said, you're right, I do. To the, excuse me, to your point about being uppity.
No, not being uppity, but perceived.
No, perceived, yeah, I understand. I also describe in the book what I, you know, again, back to what I would call the microaggressions. Early in my career, as I describe in the book, I used to hate summertime because people would go off to their vacation and the young white women would come back tanned, and they always wanted to compare their tan to me. And so as I describe in the book, one young woman comes back from a vacation in Southern California. She's a tan. She saunters up to my desk and she pokes her arm in my face and she says, look, Darryl, I'm browner than you are. And, you know, without missing a beat, I said, how would you like that brown if it was permanent? And would you want to deal with the consequences of that brown if it was permanent? And then her response was, well, you're just so serious. I don't understand. And so on a systemic racism level, the agency has something called a hall file. It's a cultural element of the agency. Is a hall file. It's your reputation.
Can I just interrupt just
Sure.
for a second?
Sure.
I think Harold has his hand up.
Oh, okay.
And why don't you continue with your thought? And
Yeah.
then Harold, you go on and ask the question after Darryl completes his thought.
So my hall file quickly became, I had a positive and negative hall file. Every employee has a hall file, but that the degrees at which the hall file impacts your career varies. And I would argue that the hall file is particularly insidious for people who are Black and brown. My positive hall file said that I knew my stuff. I had good critical thinking skills. And when I became a manager, my positive hall file said, I knew how to acquire money. I knew how to spend it in order to get the mission accomplished. My negative hall file said that I was too serious, that I could be terse and off-putting, which two words to this day I don't like, terse and off-putting, but I could be terse and off-putting, that I wouldn't go along just to get along. I would question authority when I thought things were out of line. And the hall file is an insidious element of the systemic racism because a lot of your reputation, technically your reputation, your hall file is not supposed to be brought to an interview panel or promotion panel, et cetera. but there's an awful lot of, and I know what this next part I'm about to say, having been a manager, there's a lot of stuff that occurs literally in the discussions that go on in the hallway, in the bathroom, over the phone. As I point out in the book, certainly when I became a manager, one of the things my bosses told me was never put anything in writing, especially if it could be discovered by an attorney, which would bring additional problems. And so, because I would often question what was going on around me, that exacerbated my negative hall file. Harold.
Go ahead, Harold. You got to take yourself off mute, though. There
Yes. How you doing? How you doing, Darryl?
I'm good.
Hey, quick question. I haven't finished reading your book. Not yet. I'm on about chapter 5. But anyway, I wanted to ask, I haven't got to the part about your blogs. I've read the back and front cover and so forth. And in your blog, you challenged the leadership to be more truthful, speak truth to power. So in light of what's going on today, do you feel kind of vindicated concerning your blog?
I do, in a way, because when I wrote my blog, Mike Pompeo was a director of the CIA, and he, as you may know, went on to become the Secretary of State. And you may have heard him say recently, as in last week, that the problem with America is multiculturalism and wokeism. And that was his dog whisper, his dog whistle to the Trump base. He made it very clear when he was at the agency that he thought the topics of diversity and inclusion were a waste of time, that we should get back to mission and do the work, and and stop focusing on this diversity and inclusion issues. As I describe in my book, he at least what I heard, he was never overtly anti-diversity and inclusion, but he made it known by his absences from various programs that occurred during his tenure that he thought it was a waste of time. Now, I understand later on from other colleagues after I left that he had some serious issues with the LGBTQ community at the agency, and actually prevented some of those events from occurring. But my point, yes, so vindicate, my point was, I'll try to cut to the chase. I say in my book, the 2 of the 12 directors that I worked for, John Brennan, who was the director before Pompeo, he was CIA director under President Obama, and George Tenet, who was John Brennan's mentor and was an earlier director in the 90s. They were the 2 most actively involved directors when it came to diversity and inclusion. And I'm confident if Charlottesville had occurred under John Brennan's watch, we would have had conversations about it at work. We would have talked about it. When John was the director, he specifically commissioned a study on Black and brown folks in leadership positions and women in leadership positions. I actually confronted John during a class in 2013 when he had just been confirmed as the director. I was teaching middle managers, and he came up to the podium, and when he was done speaking, I jumped up to the microphone, which, as I described in the book, I shouldn't have. It was intended for the students, but I jumped up to the microphone and I looked at John. I said, "John, you're the 11th director I've had in 30 years. Well, at that time it was 20 some years, but you're the 11th director. Tell me how you're going to be different when it comes to diversity and inclusion." And his comment to me was, you're just going to have to watch what I do and hold me accountable. And I watched him over the course of his time from 2013 to the time before the Trump administration came in. John walked the talk. His actions were congruent when it came to diversity and inclusion. He even spoke to Time magazine reporter and said what he was going to do with regards to diversity and inclusion. George Tenet, early in the 90s, George Tenet was someone who, at the time, and I discussed this in my book as well, I was the chairman of the agency's diversity council, and the agency was having some overt racism issues occurring in some of our buildings that were not at headquarters. And I was called up to Director Tenet's office along with several other people, and I was asked, what should he do? And I said, sir, you should get in your car and drive to that facility and hold people accountable. And to his credit, because as I described in the book, George Tenet was like, pardon me, a badass New York City rapper. He got in his shiny black SUV, and he wasn't going to tolerate such behavior at the agency. What I saw at the end of my career under Mike Pompeo was at a point where we were getting a little bit better than we were early in my career with regards to diversity and inclusion. I started to see the erosion of that. Anyway, so yeah, I do feel vindicated. The Trump administration did serious damage to the agency and the other federal agencies with regards to their diversity and inclusion programs. I was actually asked to consider to come out and talk to them about my book. All that was put on hold when the Trump administration said that, that no money should be spent in the federal organizations with regards to diversity and inclusion. And I wasn't even going to charge for coming out and speaking.
So we have two questions.
Sure.
So we have Darlene has a question, and then after her, Jerome. So go ahead,
Darlene's
Darlene.
my sister.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Hey, Darryl.
Hello, Darlene.
Hey, Darlene.
Hi. I wanted to ask you about your book. I haven't finished it either, like Hall said, but it's very detailed. Did you take notes along the way of the things that happened to you?
I did, and I took notes, and because I'm fortunate. I have a very good memory, although that memory is fading with time and age. But yes, I did take notes of events that occurred. As I mentioned, when I started thinking about writing this book in 2007, I started jotting down notes. One of the things that the notes did help, and as I discuss in the book, there were at least 5 times during my career where I considered bringing an EEO suit against the agency. I did not do so until 2014, a suit that I ultimately dropped because my mother, as I described in the book, my mother had fallen down the steps of her basement 2 days before her birthday in 2014. And my brothers and I were trying to get her into an assisted living facility. And I didn't want the stress of dealing with the lawsuit and dealing with my mom. So I ultimately dropped the case, although I say in the book, I think I had a very strong case that I could have pursued. Previous in my career, I had considered filing EEO suits on things that had occurred, and I did not. And part of the reason why I did not is because I had mentors, Black male, Black female mentors, seniors, especially early in my career, who said, don't do it. It will ultimately hurt you more than it will hurt the individual or hurt the institution. So anyway, did I answer your question, Darlene?
Yeah. Yes. Thanks.
Jerome, go ahead.
Hey, Darryl, great stuff, man. And I just wanted to know were you at Langley when the shooting occurred? And if you were, or even if you weren't, did the aftermath of that shooting affect the agency all the same, or were the people of color there affected in a different way from the agency at whole?
So yes, I was, in fact, I was at the agency during the shooting. I was at Langley, and interestingly enough, my supervisor at the time, he pulled up in line. If you're talking about the folks who were shot in the cars, he had pulled up in the line just as the shooter had pulled off. He didn't know what had happened. And ironically, he was honking his horn because people weren't moving their cars. It did impact. So it's funny you asked that question. It did impact people of color and impacted me. That incident, as well as 9/11, impacted me because I don't discuss this in the book, but the agency, without going into details, the agency changed its security profile after both events. Part of what I will say is part of the change in that profile was how they would randomly stop cars for identification and searches. And it was supposedly random. And as I say, I can tell people I have that third world look. And my car would frequently get stopped. It used to be able I could flash my badge and get waved through. My car would get stopped frequently for further review. And I actually sent a note to security and I said, let me understand this. This is supposed to be random, but I seem to be getting pulled over a lot randomly. So clearly it's not randomly. And I will tell you, Jerome, it was, and others, it was comments like that for me, questioning the system, that was added to my haul file. Here's somebody who doesn't know his place. Why is he questioning the fact that, we're trying to protect everybody, and he's questioning the fact that we're pulling him over? No, I'm not questioning the fact you pull him over. I want security as well. I'm questioning the fact that this is supposed to be a random process, but in a 5-day week, I've been pulled over 3 times because you think that I look like a certain kind of folk who may do harm to this agency.
Darryl, we
yeah.
have about 6 minutes
Yes.
of time, and Damani has put in the chat that we need to have a part 2
okay.
to this. There is a lot to this, and I apologize. I started the questions, and maybe I stopped your flow.
No, that's all right.
I think there are a lot of good questions that were asked, and I have as we're concluding, do you think that you made a dent in the culture at the agency?
I do. Two levels. One, with regards to diversity and inclusion. As I mentioned, I was the vice chair and then chair of the agency's diversity council in the late 1990s. And one of the things that came out of that council was we specifically made sure that prior to the council's work, the agency did not have diversity reps attending interview and promotion panels. As I discussed in the book, there's a positive and negative side of that. If you are a Black person or person of color, you spend a lot of time attending interview and promotion panels to ensure that people are being treated fairly and equitably. So I do, in that particular case, feel like I had an impact in making sure that every employee was looked at from an equitable perspective. From a leadership perspective, my last job at the agency was the director of the Leadership Learning Division. And I think I had an impact on the leadership learning culture at the agency. I used to tell folks one of the things I enjoyed about being a teacher, especially a teacher of leadership and management, is there's a multiplication effect, a multiplier effect. Every time I stood up in front of a classroom, or one of my instructors stood up in front of a classroom, when we did our job and did it well, let's say when we did our job well, and I think we did it well many, many times more than not, individuals leaving our classes were then going off and responsible for 10, 20, 100 other people. So I do think I had an impact on the agency's leadership culture as well. And then lastly, I like to think that I had an impact on individuals in their perceptions of the world. And I'll use a quick example, back to the spear chucker. There was a gentleman, and I refer to him as Johnny in the book, a gentleman who was in the room when I was called the spear chucker back in 1991. And after my podcast came out, Johnny, who is now a senior executive at the agency, has been a senior executive for a long time, he hit me up on LinkedIn and he said, you know, I remember that and I apologize for not stepping up and saying more of, you know, he was a bystander. And so having an impact on individuals, I'd like to think I had an impact on individuals. I mentor a lot of people. And for me, my measure of my purpose in life is, since I've retired, I've had people reach out to me and ask, have stayed in contact with me. I continue to mentor individuals. You know, I had a young man approach me. I say young, he's in his early 40s, approached me recently, young Black man who, and looking to make a career move. And we, even despite COVID, we met, had coffee. I connected him with individuals that I knew are still at the agency. And he is transitioning to a new job, which is a better fit for him. And so I do think I had that kind of impact as well. I guess I will end this session by saying, I wish I had, I'm not sorry I retired when I did. There were things that I still would have liked to have accomplished before I had retired. But ultimately, it was my health that was more important than the organization. Because one of the things, and I'll end on this. So in 2008, I had brain surgery. And one of the things I learned in 30 days of being off after my brain surgery was the world continues to move, and the cogs continue to grind, whether you're around or not. And ultimately, in the end, you know, I'm confident if I had stayed, I would not be talking to you right now. And I just turned 59. I hope to have many more years ahead of me. But I know deep in me that if I had stayed, I would have probably died at my desk. And that's not an exaggeration. And so I do think I made a difference. I made a difference on the diversity inclusion culture. I think I made a difference in the leadership culture. I think I made a difference in individual lives, not just Black and brown folks, but white folks as well, who needed to hear sometimes the hard truth. And I think those hard truths are, even to this day, are resonating with them as a result of things like George Floyd. And I'll end on this. A number of the folks that I used to work with, particularly white folks, as a result of George Floyd, I've had a lot of Zoom sessions with people who wanted just to have the conversation. And so I've had a lot of deep, hard conversations with folks about what they can do, what's their role in changing the racial dynamic, not only at work, but across their communities and across the US. And so, yeah, I do think I made a difference.
Well, you certainly made a difference on this program. And let me just say,
I hope so. This went really quick, and I didn't say probably much of what I wanted to say, but
yeah, well, that's why we need to have part 2. Perhaps next month we can arrange to meet again. I just want to say, aside from the clandestine nature of the agency where you worked, you just seem like a Black man or Black woman, African-American woman in the corporate structure. And these are the type of things that you run into. You know, you run into the subtle, you run into the overt, and it seems like you navigated them well. I want to thank everyone for coming. We had 34 at the height of this. We had a lot of family members from Darryl's family,
which I appreciate.
What did you say? Like 60 cousins, and so, you know,
minimum.
It's just so many of y'all. You know,
Sharon, Jerome Spears, Renee Spears, Darlene, my sister, my cousin Ron up there, and I think my Uncle Buddy is up here. Yeah.
Yes, and some of us we're just meeting this evening. I just want
Wow. Sandy Spears.
Thank you.
And I'm here, Damani. This is Sheila.
Oh, Sheila, hey, Sheila, hey, okay. Hey, brother, Ms. Imhotep. Do we got
I'm here too, Darryl.
Oh, thank you, Donna.
This is Donna.
Donna.
How you doing?
Hey, Ms. Imhotep.
Yes.
We got a brother, Jerome Spears, up here. Jerome is an expert on DNA. He know how to trace the mitochondria back to the mother.
Mitochondrial.
Can you have a minute to let him speak about what he does?
Darryl, Jerome, can you do that in a minute?
In 30 seconds, I'll tell you.
All right, go ahead, man.
I'll tell you that we've DNA tested a bunch of people. The more people you test, the greater your discoveries can be. We've gone all the way back to Africa with our DNA on our mother's side of the family. We've done mitochondrial testing, we've done Y testing, we've done autosomal testing. And once you get started with this, it's hard to stop. So I'll leave it there.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming again. This has been Black Knowledge Matters, and certainly the Black knowledge that was imparted this evening was great. I want to thank everyone that from across the country and across the city coming in, and we'll see you next week. Oh, before I let you go, hold tight. I just want to read. We have another big heavyweight coming next week, and we're having Dr. Salim Faraji. He's from the Amun-Ra Theological Seminary, and he's going to be discussing towards an African spiritual renaissance. So we're looking to have another great session. Of everybody, I wish somebody would mute themselves.
Can somebody turn their mute on? We can hear your music. I mean, your TV.
Yeah, come on now. All right, I don't want to have to be the policeman and mute you. Yeah, Jerome, we'll get you on the schedule if you'd like. It seems very interesting. And well, yes.
No, I was going to say before you go, I had one last thing to say as well. If you mind.
Oh yes, okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead and finish.
No. You have the floor, sir.
I just wanted to say, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak. Appreciate the time. I hope you all were able to take away what you were expected to have taken away. If we have an opportunity to do it again, I look forward to that. And if you have an opportunity, if you have an opportunity to buy my book and read it, that's great. Again, bookbaby.com. The ebook is $7.99, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple iBooks. The paperback is more expensive than I wanted it to be. It's $45.99, and also at bookbaby.com. But I really appreciate, Minister, for you and your church for inviting me out tonight. And I really thank you all, and for my family, love you all. And I really appreciate you all coming out and supporting me.
Oh, that's great. And I want to say you need to thank Damani. He's always talking about how great his family is, and I can see why he's so proud. And I'm glad that you all showed up today. And we love Brother Damani and Harold. I got to meet Harold a few times here in Sacramento. I can't tell you guys apart now that it's on the screen. I'm glad you have on different clothing. You guys even sound alike. All right.
Excuse me, Emetep, can you announce the speaker again since there was competition?
Oh, yes. The speaker is Dr. Faraji, Dr. Salim Faraji, and he is an associate professor of Africana Studies at Cal State Dominguez, and he's going to be discussing towards an African spiritual renaissance. I don't have time to read his resume, but it's this big. So tune in next time, this same Zoom, 5 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. I'm going to conclude with Uncle Job Seneb, Life, Prosperity, and Health. Jerome and Darryl, we're going to get in touch with you because we'd like to get you on. All right.
Thank you.
Take care.
Appreciate it.
All right.